Welcome to Knitting Matters. This is season 3, episode 12. I'm just going to check that we are live. We had a small problem a moment ago, so hopefully we are and that you can hear me. I'm going to ask somebody to tell me that you can hear me. Okay, I think you can hear me okay. So that's great. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me. Whether you're watching live or the replays later, I'm delighted that you're here. I'm Cheryl Lampard. I'm an image consultant. I'm a fibre artist, a knitting educator, a Craft Yarn Council certified knitting instructor, and I used to be a yarn store owner. And one of the great things about owning a yarn store is that I got to teach people how to knit. I loved doing it then, and I love doing it now. Now, today's episode is all about gauge. We knitters have this love-hate relationship with this 5-letter word. I hear people say, oh, I hate checking gauge, and I never check it. I hear that all the time. And why do we have such a strong reaction about it? Well, it does take time to do swatches, and we think of them, as a bit boring. Because we would just want to get on with our knitting. We want to get on with it, an exciting new project, and it seems that checking gauges, takes up time. We don't think we need to do it, but it is so very important. Now, in the last 2 episodes, which were on sweater design basics, we talked a lot about different things, and one of the crucial things, if you are sweater designing, is to understand the relationship between gauge and the size of your garment. So this topic of gauge today ties in beautifully with those episodes. Also, if you're starting your knitting journey, it's the perfect time to learn about gauge. If you're an intermediate knitter, I hope that this will refresh your understanding of gauge. And if you are a die-hard, I never check my gauge knitter, then I hope after watching, then you'll look at gauge in a completely different light. So, gauge and tension, they do mean the same thing. I know in the UK we use the word tension rather than gauge. I kind of like to separate them because I do think gauge is a good word for, knitting pattern gauge and doing gauge swatches, whereas tension in my head relates more to personal knitting tension. But you will find that they can be interchangeable. They do mean sort of the same things. Anyway, gauge or tension, simply put, is the number of stitches and rows per inch based on the size of a knitted stitch. And the size of the stitch will vary depending on yarn, needle size, and personal knitting tension. Now, we knitters control our yarn tension by usually weaving it through our fingers in some way. And everyone has a preferred way of doing that, a different hold for the yarn. And it is something that newbie knitters often struggle with to start off with. Added to that, every knitter has their own personal tension. Some people naturally knit tighter, others knit more loosely. So all those things come into play. Also, you have to think about the type of yarn that you're knitting with and even our mood, whether we're relaxed or stressed. All those things can affect our knitting tension. So it's hardly surprising that achieving the gauge that's specified on the pattern can be a challenge. Some of you, I do hear tell that people leave their knitting sometimes for quite a while, or they have several projects on the go. Mea culpa, guilty as charged. But sometimes when you pick up that knitting, if you've left it a long way and you start knitting, your gauge can be completely different. And it's just the way it is. So achieving pattern gauge can be a bit tricky, but there are quite a lot of things to consider. I'm going to move the camera now to the worktop. Okay, hopefully you can see me okay. I just want to make sure it's not too bright. So, pattern gauge. I'm going to show you 3 samples here. I'm just going to lift that a bit better. Okay. There's 3 samples here. All are the same size, 20 stitches and 24 rows. Right, let me try and get that into a better focus for you there. It's a bit bright and I'm trying to, hold on a second, let's get that a bit better. No, oh dear. Ah, that's better. Now we have it. Sorry about that. I did a lighter colour so you could see it, but of course it is a little bright. I'm just going to turn a light down a second. I think it is too much. Hold on a second. If you will, as if you're going to go like that. That might be better. Yeah, I think it is. I might be in dark, but at least you can see what's going on. Sorry about that. Okay, so each of these samples, each of these swatches is 20 stitches and 24 rows. And I've done one on a size, US size 5, I've done one on a US size 6 and a US size 7. In metric terms, that's a 3.75, a 4 millimeter and a 4.5 millimeter. And I just want you to, you might think, well, it doesn't matter, you know, what needle size. I'm doing the size that the pattern says. But if your gauge, if your personal tension is a bit different, you're going to get a very different gauge. So let me show you. This is, I'm layering them on top of each other. This is the US size 5, the 3.75 millimeter. And I've layered it on top of the 4 millimeter, which is the US 6. It doesn't look like there's much difference there, but there is a little. You can see I'm almost a stitch different in terms of width there. And these were blocked, so it's almost a stitch different. Height is pretty similar, although again, I've still got these on the needle. You can see it's sort of half a stitch height different. And if I had put this on the third swatch, which is on the US 7 needle of 4.5 millimeter, you can really see the difference there. Substantial difference there, both in width. I've got 2 stitches there difference, and certainly a stitch height, a row height difference. And that's just within 3 sizes of needles. So on a swatch, not much difference, but imagine that's across the width of a sweater or the length of the sweater. If you're knitting on it, if your gauge isn't, if your personal tension isn't knitting the gauge as specified, you can end up with a dramatically different sweater. So that's a good example of, you know, what seems like very similar looking swatches, but actually they'll be different once you've kind of upgraded those to a sweater size. So what are the things we have to think about? I'll bring those back again. So we need to think pattern gauge. What are we talking about with pattern gauge? Pattern gauge is the gauge as specified in the pattern, and as for the yarn that's specified in the pattern. So pattern gauge is about the gauge for the yarn specified in that particular pattern. So it's essentially yarn gauge for the pattern. Then that comes on to designer's intent. That means it's the gauge and the yarn specified to achieve the look and the size of the garment shown. It's what the designer intended. Now the ball band gauge, that's something else again. And often people say, well, look, you know, the ball band gives me an idea. A bit bright. Okay. I'm not going to fiddle about with light, but I will tell you that on this ball band, for the yarn that I have used for those little samples I just showed you, it says it will do, you can use a number 6 to 9 needle, and you'll get 4.5 to 5 stitches to 1 inch. That's for knitting. Okay, I'm sorry you can't see that so well. But if you think about it, I have used sizes 5, 6 and 7. A size 9 will give me a very different result. But let's have a look. Let's just see if we're anywhere near matching that. Just quickly, just out of amusement, if you will. I'm going to do this on across 2 inches. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And we'd normally do it across 4 inches at least. So yeah, the 5 stitches are there-ish, but it's not very accurate. 4.5 to 5 stitches to 1 inch. Yeah, it's a very general assumption. So I wouldn't, it's a guide, use it as a guide, and that's all. Helpful, but it's very general. And then we're talking about your personal gauge. Now this is where people get upset with things, because they say my gauge isn't coming out to what the pattern says. That's okay. It's your personal knitting tension. It's yours. It's not wrong. Can it be changed? Well, I'm glad you asked, because yes, it can be adjusted and you can make it work. And we're coming on to that a moment later. When it comes to the size of swatch, your swatch, and we do have to do them, no getting away from it. Your swatch needs to be larger than the usual 4x4 measurement, because it's great that you can measure 4x4, but you want your swatch to be larger. You want the swatch to actually be larger so I can get a clear run of 4 inches, because if I'm only knitting to 4 inches, my edge stitch is going to affect the measurement. All sorts of things are going to affect that. So I want to make sure that I've got a good, clear run of 4 inches. Okay. But if you're knitting, double knitting worsted, sport, Aran, you need to knit at least 5 to 6 inches for your swatch, both in width and rows. If you're knitting a chunky yarn, you need to do a much larger swatch, because clearly if you're only getting something like 3 stitches to an inch, you've got to do a much larger swatch to actually measure that properly. So when it comes to measuring gauge, unless stated, and this is important, unless otherwise stated, just got my label caught around my swatch, unless otherwise stated, the gauge that's given in patterns is always the finished gauge, i.e. the blocked gauge. That said, it's certainly worth making a note of your unblocked gauge, because it helps you understand if your gauge has changed over time. I know that Patty Lyons, who is a great knitting guru, she actually does all her gauge swatches one after the other, and she divides them with a row of pearls, because she says that she's lazy. I don't think you could describe Patty Lyons as lazy, but she likes to do them one after the other, and she never sort of pulls them out again for that project. She just does, you know, whatever her test swatches are, one after the other, divided by a row of pearl bumps. And that way she can check back to see which was the best fit. It's a good record of what she did previously, and I think that's a great idea. I'm probably going to start doing it her way on that. So, gauge in patterns is given in the finished gauge, i.e. the blocked gauge, but do make a note of your unblocked gauge in that sense when you're doing the knitting, once you've got a bit of knitting further up the needle so that you can let your knitting sort of be free enough to lay down and measure it. It's worth just checking the gauge and making a note of it. So many of you know how to check gauge, but for the benefit of those that don't, I will just show you. This is a 5x5 swatch. You don't have to have anything fancy, just a ruler, and of course I've picked a ruler here that is shiny, but a ruler is fine. I'm going to switch over to my little gizmo here, only because it's not going to reflect so much. So what I want to do, these things are really handy. I like the fact that I've got 4 inches here and 4 inches across. And what I want to do, I want to get it so that I've got the sort of the V of the stitch as a complete stitch. I want to start where I've got that. So let's have just a look. And then I would count. So there is my 4 inch mark. So that's, and I like to use something with a pointy end so I can sort of poke in. So that is 1 stitch, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. Okay. And let's have a look at rows. I want to make sure it's straight. So 22 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 31, 32. Okay, 32. So my personal gauge for this swatch was 22 stitches and 32 rows on that. I don't remember what size needle I did. Oh, I have got a note here. I think, what size needle did I do? That was a US 6, okay? So that is how you check your gauge. So let's move on. Now I have a whole bunch of swatches here. These are things that I did for my CYC certification, and what I have done is labeled them all with what it is and the gauge that I had. And if I'm looking at them again, I can see that I had different gauges for different types of knitting, and that's quite normal. I had to achieve a specific sample size. It was almost actually the reverse of a pattern requirement when you're trying to match a gauge. I had to kind of reverse engineer that, because I needed to get my swatches to be 5 inches high and 5 inches across. So I had to do a couple of test pieces first to see how many stitches I worked out for a few inches, and then kind of build it up so it matched the pattern, and that I could get as close to 5 inches as possible. And designers, when they're designing patterns, they're going to have to do that as well, or you may have to do that. You may have to reverse engineer it. Anyway, it's the same principle. I had to adjust my gauge, my tension, to get to that 5 inches. And I had to use different sizes of needles. I mean, this one I can see, this is a garter stitch. I used a size 4.5 millimeter, a US 7 for that one. For this bit of fair on here, I needed to use a 4 millimeter needle, which was a US 6. I think for the intarsia, that was also a US 6, a 4 millimeter needle, but the amount of stitches, it was different, as it was different for the pearl and again the fair and the mosaic. Yeah, again, I was able to use 4 millimeter US 6, but there was 22 stitches and 50 rows for this, because mosaic, you're doing, 2 passes, if you will, for 1 row. So it will differ, it will change. So adjusting your gauge, if you need to adjust your gauge, what do? You go, the first thing to try is going up or down a needle size or 2. That's the first thing to try. If your knitting gauge is coming out, if you've got more stitches to the inch than the required gauge, it's too small. So you go to a larger needle. If you've got more stitches than the specified gauge per inch, then, I'll start again. If you've got more stitches than specified for the gauge, you need to go up a needle size or 2 larger. 1 or 2 larger. Try 1 size first and then increase it if you need to. If you have fewer stitches per inch, your gauge is too big and you go to a smaller needle. So if you've got more stitches per inch, you need to go to a larger needle, because your garment is going to come out too small otherwise. If you have fewer stitches per inch, your gauge is too big, so you go to a smaller needle. You may have to go up or down more than 1 needle size to achieve the gauge that you need. So, and do more than 1 swatch. You expect to do more than 1 swatch. That's absolutely fine. I did several swatches for some of these, which drove me nuts, but actually I was determined to get it right. And some were easier than others. The intarsia, I tend to knit a little bit loose for intarsia, so I needed to really adjust that, whereas other things I tend to knit a little tight. It's very interesting how, the same pair of hands and the same needle size can give you a different result based on the pattern stitch that you're doing. So the only way to be sure that your garment size is going to come out as you want it to is to do a swatch where you match the pattern and the yarn gauge. So you therefore end up with the right dimensions. The only way to do it is to swatch. And it doesn't matter that you have to do several. I tend to now keep all my swatches. I mean, these were for a purpose, but I keep all the ones that I do, and I do label them. Maybe not as comprehensively as this, but I label the needle size, the stitch and row count, and the type of yarn that I use. Because if it's a yarn that I like to use, and I want to come back to it, I know then what I've got a starting point for my gauge. So the other thing you have to think about is the gauge measured over a stocking stitch pattern or a fancy stitch pattern? Whatever it is, follow what the pattern says. Often they will give you, if there is a pattern, stitch pattern involved, as well as stockinette stitch, or if there's colour work involved, they may well give you two gauges. They'll give you a gauge worked in pattern and a gauge worked in stockinette stitch. You've got to do two swatches then. You've got to do as many swatches as they give you gauges. Now, other than to achieve the correct dimensions, why else might we want to swatch? Well, we actually might not like the fabric or the stitch pattern when we've knitted it. We might not like it. We might not, we might feel it's a bit too kind of loose, that we want to tighten it up, or we want to relax it a bit. So it's a good way of checking what the fabric's going to be like and how it's going to behave. You might decide that you don't like the feel of the fabric against your skin. How heartbreaking to knit a whole sweater and then find that you really don't like wearing it. But you can tuck one of these swatches sort of under your clothing next to your skin, wear it for a day or several hours to see if it's comfortable or not. Much better to have spent time doing a few swatches and then decide it's not comfortable to wear than a whole sweater. That's heartbreaking. And then I want you to really mistreat your swatches. You wash it, dry it, treat it badly. See how it behaves. Does the yarn pill? Does it fluff up or does it flatten? It's also very important if you're making yarn substitutions. It's imperative to swatch if you're using a different yarn. The designer has created it using a specific yarn, and okay, you've substituted using a yarn that's the same gauge and maybe the same fibre content, but it could be different. You might find that it comes out very differently. And as I said just a moment ago, colour work often comes out at a different gauge. These three samples certainly did. My Fair Isle, my Intarsia and my Mosaic samples were all slightly different gauges. Even if I use the same needle size, the stitch count was slightly different. So you need to swatch for however many changes are in the pattern. Now, it's perfectly okay to change gauge and use two different gauges in a pattern. So let's say you want a tad more room across the bust or maybe across the bicep, but you don't want to actually significantly alter the pattern. Well, you could go to a larger size needle. If you wanted to nip the waist in a little on a sweater, you could go down a needle size. Let me show you this glove. I believe I have shown this before, but for different reasons. This is a glove that I'm going to re-knit because I don't really like the fingers. But what's so interesting about this sort of gauntlet glove is that, yes, we start off with cables and there are several stitches between the cables and they decrease as we go up. But once we get to this point, there's two stitches between each cable, two garter stitches between each cable. But then after this point, the needle size changes. I went down, I think it's 2 needle sizes from here to get this really snug round the wrist. And the joy of that is that you don't really notice that you've changed gauge. So if you think how you could apply this if you were, if this was the waist of a sweater, you just want to snug it in. I don't know what's happened there. Oh, sorry. Gosh, it's a night of technical difficulties today. Where I was going with that was if this was, say, a waist of a sweater and you just want to snug it in a little bit, you could do that without decreasing, you could do that without changing the stitch count, any of that. You just go down a needle or 2 sizes and it would make such a difference. If I put my hand in this, it's really nice and snug around my wrist where I want it to be, and yet it's exactly the same cable as here. It's just a little smaller. So don't think that you can't do that sort of thing. You can. Okay. Right, the other time where you need to check gauge for sure, and we did this a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to just switch back so I'm talking to you. Is there anything where gauge doesn't matter? Well, oh, sorry, I was talking about knitting in the round. I do beg your pardon. Gauge is different to flat knitting. We covered that in season 3, episode 9, the questions you asked video, and definitely there is a different way. There is a better way to swatch for knitting in the round, because remember, when you're knitting in the round, you're only doing knit stitching, you're not doing purl stitches, and that means your gauge comes out differently. So that's another reason to swatch. But do have a look at that episode if you want to know how to do an easy swatch for swatching in the round. Season 3, episode 9. So is there anything where gauge doesn't actually matter? And I'd never actually say it doesn't matter, but for things like toys, scarves, shawls, it may not be critical. Now, if it's a very different gauge, be aware that the item will come out a different size. I have done this purple shawl many times, and now I've got to remember to change again. Okay, I've done this shawl and I love the pattern. I've done it many times and I've shown you it several times. I did a different yarn to what was depicted in the pattern because that yarn was no longer available, and I wasn't keen on the yarn substitutes that they gave me. But I have tried it. This is a sport weight. It's a silk merino yarn, and I love the sheen on it. I love everything about it, and I've done this one several times in this particular yarn. I've also done it in a slightly heavier yarn, and it comes out much thicker and bigger because I did go up a needle size, and that's fine. You just need to be aware that different weights and different needle sizes will give you different sizes. So in something like a scarf or a shawl, something like this, it's not going to matter too much. You just need to be aware about it. So let's, excuse me taking a sip of water. I'm drying up here. Just bear with me a moment, please. Sorry about that. So now we have the knotty question of stitch gauge and row gauge. Patterns do put row gauges in, and we tend to think they don't matter too much. You know, do we need to worry about row gauge? Well, as you could see from these samples, there was a difference in the amount of, we had the same amount of rows, but the height, the length was different based on the needle size that we used. So remember that stitch gauge affects the width of the item. Too many stitches to the inch, the item will be smaller than specified. Fewer stitches to the inch, it'll be larger. So why does row gauge matter? Because it's not going to affect the width of the garment. And really, is it going to affect the length? Because patterns often say, knit for 18 inches. Well, 18 inches is 18 inches, or whatever it is. But it does matter, especially if you have a stitch pattern or a colour work pattern where you want it to end at a certain focal point. Let's say this was a garment or an item where I wanted to make sure I got 3 repeats of my pattern, or the pattern, the actual instructions say you want to finish at a neckline, and you should have, I don't know, so many repeats before you start shaping a neckline, for example, because it looks it's aesthetically better if you start the neckline at a certain point. So they've designed the pattern like that. Well, if your row gauge is out, you're not going to get the same measurement when you start your neckline. May not matter too much, but it could be, you know, an inch, it could be less than you want. So row gauge does matter. You would need to check that. And really importantly, even if your pattern says, well, knit for 18 inches before shaping, when you get to the shaping zone, if your row gauge is off, it will affect the shaping area. So let's say, I'll just get the notepad here. Let's say you've knitted to your area where you want to shape, you know, you've knitted up here and now you're shaping for the armhole or something like that. Let's say often the instructions say decrease every 4 rows or every 6 rows, something like that, especially on a neckline, they might do that. If you're increasing every 4 rows or decreasing to shape, whether it's the armhole, it might be a sort of armhole that's coming in a bit more, especially if it's a little vesty sort of tank top thing. Well, if your gauge is off, your 4 rows are either going to be less per inch than the designer had in mind, or more. So you could end up with your shaping where it's not needed or where you don't want it. The shaping could all sort of end up in the wrong place, or squashed or stretched out. So you could find your shaping is not where you need it, or you're going to have a longer garment to accommodate all the rows that you need. So do think about that if your row gauge is off. And if your row gauge is off, you just need to do a bit of math to accommodate your row gauge. It's quite hard sometimes if changing needle sizes doesn't work. It's tricky. You know, you've got to do something else, and your gauge is your gauge. Your tension is your tension. So you need to sort of adjust the pattern to the amount of inches in the shaping zone to accommodate your gauge, if that makes sense. You know, gauge isn't written in stone. Can be played about with. Right. Coming back to the full screen. So, in conclusion, we are swatching because we want to understand how the fabric behaves, and that's crucial in planning the garment or item that we're creating. And garment makers and dressmakers, they prepare their fabric by pre-shrinking because they want to know how it'll behave after it's made up. It's kind of the same principle. We're swatching to obtain the fabric that we want. And please remember that the designer's gauge isn't necessarily yours. And that's fine. The ball band gauge is arbitrary. It just can't be all that because it's so general. It's a guide. Your gauge is your gauge. Knit how you knit. That's it. You can tweak your gauge or you can adjust the pattern to accommodate your personal knitting gauge. So I know that was a lot, and I'm sorry about the technical difficulties at the beginning. Hope it didn't spoil your enjoyment of the program. I do know that was a lot, but I do hope it was helpful to you. Gauge is really important, and if you've never done swatches before or you're out of the habit of doing them, please have another go. You might find it makes all the difference to the fit of your garment. So, as always, this episode and all the others are uploaded to our Knitting Matters page afterwards, and they're also uploaded to our YouTube channel of the same name, Knitting Matters. You can watch the replays at any time, and it is always easier to watch them on YouTube. They're all listed. There is a whole playlist there. Do like us on YouTube and subscribe to it. If you subscribe to it, you'll get new episodes as they're published automatically. If you're searching for this episode later, this is Season 3, Episode 12. So, in between now and the next episode, keep well, keep calm, and keep knitting. Bye for now.